people need to go out. Now, you can't go to a bar, you can't go to the cinemas, right? Singapore is very small. It's not as if you can go to a next state to go hiking or whatever. So what's left, and what do we love? Food, right? So the restaurants are doing famously well at the moment, which is really, really nice to see.
I'm Dani Valent, and this is Dirty Linen, the podcast that takes the issues the hospitality industry finds hard to air in public and shakes them all about. Today on Dirty Linen, we are heading to one of the world's best food cities, Singapore, and Annette Tan. Annette runs FatFuku. She's going to tell us more about that. She's a fellow food writer, a lover of eating. She welcomes people into her home for dinners, and I'm really thrilled to have her here to give us the lowdown on what's happening in Singapore right now. Welcome, Annette.
Thanks, Dani. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Tell me what FatFuku is.
So FatFuku is I guess what you guys would call a supper club. Here in Singapore, it's better known as a private dining establishment. So essentially, I cook meals and serve them in my home, and people can make reservations to just come in and have a meal, really.
Right. So obviously we're in a global pandemic. It sounds like it's not the best place to have a group of people over to eat. Tell me what the situation is in Singapore. Give us a bit of a rundown of what's happened in Singapore this year.
So at this point, the situation is pretty under control. I think Singaporeans have started, going back to normal, as much as normal is these days. So a lot of us work from home and alternate between the office, say 1 week in the office, 1 week at home. People are dining out like as much as possible, even though we're restricted to reservations of no more than 5 people at each table. The parks are open. People can go back to the gym in limited numbers. So life is pretty much as normal as it gets in these times here, really.
Okay. So there are still, I think, around 50 cases a day in Singapore. But we heard in Australia, Singapore was one of the big success stories in quashing COVID. But then just as we've had here in Melbourne, you had a second wave. Can you talk about the nature of that second wave?
I don't know about a second wave per se. So maybe just to explain a little bit about kind of how things are categorized here. As most people know, Singapore has a large migrant population that was very affected by COVID because they live in pretty crowded dormitories. So in that population of migrant workers, we've had the hugest numbers. I can't give you the exact numbers of how many of them have gotten it, but in comparison to the Singaporean community who live outside of these dormitories, the numbers are huge, right? So as far as I know, yesterday we had only 1 new case in the community. We had 13 imported cases. So these are people who maybe have just returned to Singapore and they've been spotted based on the tests that they all have to take when they come into the country. So we have 76 people in hospital at the moment, and community facilities, which would include the dorms, the dorms, they're like 2,000. So you can see the big difference between the general population, if you will, and people, then the migrant population, yeah.
And so that migrant population where there's perhaps a few dozen cases a day, are they pretty much locked down still while the rest of the city goes about life more or less normally?
Yes. It's a bit embarrassing to say, but yes.
Oh, well, it's just, every country has to deal with it differently depending on their own circumstances. And it's, it does sound pretty harsh, I guess, that a sector of society is locked down, whereas others aren't. I guess we had a different but analogous situation in Melbourne where there was a great controversy because we had some public housing towers that were locked down, whereas the rest of the city was in, certain number of, certain restrictions, but this was a harder lockdown. So, it is really harsh. And I suppose one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's highlighted inequalities in society, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, more so here for us, it's always been something that Singaporeans know but don't really talk about, how the fact that these migrant workers who are in Singapore and are pretty much building the infrastructure for us live in pretty dismal conditions. And if nothing else, COVID has really brought into very stark relief how they live and the difference between how they are treated and how we are treated.
So I know that a lot of the migrants that live in Singapore are Bangladeshi. Are there other large national groups that are staying in those hostels, or whatever you call them, dormitories?
I think the largest population are the Bangladeshis. There are some Chinese, if I'm not wrong, smaller numbers from Nepal and things like that, and Burma or Myanmar. But the largest population in that community are the Bangladeshis.
Okay. And you said that they're doing a lot of construction in the city. Are they also the housemaids, or is that more people from other parts?
No, the housemaids, they're mainly Filipino, Indonesians. Those are the two dominant groups in terms of domestic workers.
Okay, and they've just stayed in their domestic situations right through?
Pretty much. They live with the families. They have to live with the families that they work for. So, they quarantine with the rest of the family.
Got it, yeah. It's when I think about Singapore, I think about, bustling streets, the hawker markets, of course, and it's really hard to think about a city that is so food-driven. I mean, honestly, you could stop anyone on the street or anyone that you meet and you could stand there for about 5 hours and talk about food. Actually, that's not true, because you would get dragged by them to about 6 different places to eat the food that we were talking about, right? So
very true, yes.
So when you had the initial shutdown, can you talk about what that was like? Because I just can't imagine it.
So shutdown was tough for everyone. I think just before shutdown, we had these announcements about how, now there are restrictions and going to the supermarket and all of that before they really locked down the city. So we had, like many other countries, people running to the supermarket. There were queues in the markets, in the supermarkets, people were hoarding food and all of that. And then when they finally did lock us down, essentially things like, the restaurants now had to pivot to deliveries, right? Same for the hawkers. So there was a lot of community help, which was really nice. So people set up groups because, the hawkers are largely run by older folk who are not technologically driven. So it was hard for them to, even if they wanted to do delivery and take orders, they obviously wouldn't know how to. So there were several groups of people who came together and said, okay, we're going to volunteer and help, the hawkers start websites or ordering systems so that they could do it quickly, they could pivot quickly, and people could order with ease and get the food delivered. With the restaurants, a lot of them did their own thing and pivoted themselves. And then we had like delivery services, in particular a company called Oddle, and they helped a lot of restaurants pivot to island-wide delivery. So Singaporeans, as you know, love to eat. So, of course, people started ordering food because they couldn't go out, but they needed to eat food that was not cooked by themselves, obviously. So, delivery and all that suddenly became the norm, and a lot of restaurants, it became their bread and butter, so to speak. What was really nice to see is that people started sending each other food, right? Because in Singapore, it's the one thing you bond over, food. You go out and eat with your friends, you talk to strangers about food, as you said earlier. So what happened was, and it was especially apparent on Instagram, was that people would either cook something really nice and send it to their friends and family, and even to people that they didn't know but had met on Instagram.
That's so nice.
Yeah, I for one started a community project encouraging people to buy food from restaurants because, obviously the restaurants were suffering, and this was especially in the beginning of the lockdown. And it really pained me to see restaurateurs who are my friends, wondering how their business was going to carry on because, 2 months before the lockdown, already people had stopped going out and things like that. So they were already losing money. So I started something called My Treat, which encourages people to buy a restaurant meal and send it to a friend.
I love that.
All in the name of, thank you, all in the name of, supporting their favorite businesses because we didn't know how long lockdown was going to last. And when it did lift, whether our favorite businesses would still be around. So, if you asked me to buy myself a $30 lunch, I might not do it. But if you said, a friend, she's alone, she's feeling down, would I buy her lunch? Absolutely. So that was kind of the premise, of encouraging people to buy each other lunch. So very quickly after, and I'm not saying that I started any of this trend, but very quickly we noticed that more and more Singaporean foodies especially were buying each other meals, right? And they would post it on Instagram. And I also noticed a community of food lovers on Instagram who had never met in person, but they started connecting on Instagram and they would discover something new, this hawker that was say purveying some really special dish, and this person would buy 10 of these and send it to these people that they've spoken to but had never met on Instagram, right? And they're all Singaporeans.
Oh, I love it so much.
So that was really nice to see. Yeah.
Annette, tell me about some of your favourite Singaporean food, like if you've got a favourite hawker or a favourite little restaurant that you can just make me salivate as you tell me about it.
My favorite food, well, one of the things I love to eat is prawn noodles, which you can find in just about every coffee shop or hawker center in Singapore. So there's one near my house. It's called Famous Traditional Prawn Noodles. It's not actually famous, but it's traditional, and the noodles are really good. So it's just down the road from my house in a very unassuming hawker center, and that's where I go when I'm not out eating at a restaurant for work. And you were asking me about my favorite restaurants in Singapore?
Well, just go a bit deeper and tell us what prawn noodles are, and what makes a good one.
Okay, so traditionally prawn noodles are yellow wheat noodles, and they come in this really, really rich prawn stock, like a consommé, but really, really packed with prawn shells and a stock made of prawn shells, and sometimes they add a little bit of dried orange peel and pork bones and things like that. So it's a really, really robust stock, and it's served with fresh prawns, some pork, and always with a really nice chili sauce that comes with it.
Oh, sounds so good.
And it's one of those comforting things. It's one of those comforting things that you would just, it's a bowl that costs $3.50 to $5, and it's a quick and very, very satisfying lunch.
So good. And did anybody send you any food during lockdown?
Well, because of the nature of my work, I literally got food 3 times a day from various restaurants, or people who. It was crazy.
You had to eat a lot to support the restaurants.
I did, and my neighbors too, obviously, because I'm a single person. I live. There's only so much I can eat. So every day my doorbell would ring, at lunch and maybe in the middle of the afternoon and then just before dinner. And all my neighbors would be like, what's next? Because we got some really, really good food.
Wow, you are the right person to be next to in lockdown.
Absolutely. I can't argue with that because I had way too much food.
When I think about Singapore and the hawker markets there, I mean, there are already quite a few rules. Like it's very hygienic. You feel like everything's super clean and you can be very confident eating anywhere, I reckon. But what's changed with the rules around COVID?
So more than anything, there are less seats. So social distancing is a big thing here. They reconfigured it such that if, say, there was a table of 5, now you can seat only 3 at that table. And then perhaps the table beside it has been blocked off so that people can't sit down too close to one another. Same thing if you're queuing up for food, you have to keep like a meter's distance between the next person. And we have what we call social distance ambassadors who sort of patrol the restaurants and the hawker centres to make sure that people adhere to these, make sure people wear their mask and adhere to the social distancing imperatives.
Oh, that's so interesting. So they're employed by the government, or does each hawker centre employ the social distance ambassador?
No, they're employed by the government.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, they're employed by the government. So they're in like the wet markets, which, as you might know, are really crowded in the mornings, right?
Yeah.
So they're sort of in all the high traffic areas where people go to eat, or the gyms and things like that. The government has also started a new quality mark called SG Clean, and basically restaurants, F&B establishments, hawkers can all apply to be certified SG Clean. So there's like a checklist of seven different things where they that they have to do, like sanitize tables after every use. And if you're a bigger establishment, you sanitize tables every hour, things like that, to make sure that, the industry standard is at a pretty high level collectively.
Yeah, right. Interesting. So here we've got people going around sanitising tram stops and public areas. Is it a job creation program as well as keeping people safe?
Yes, very much so. I think a lot of the ambassadors, a lot of people who may have lost their jobs or taking a hiatus from work because of COVID. So yeah, it does create a good number of jobs.
So Singapore's bar culture is also, something that people go there for. How are the bars at the moment? Are they open as normal?
Oh, the bars are suffering a little bit more because they are only allowed to serve, or any establishment is only allowed to serve alcohol up to 10:30. After 10:30, literally, you have to put your glasses down. Do not drink, because a social ambassador is going to come in and fine you. And that has happened before. People have tried to sort of push the limits a little bit. So there have been cases where the entire establishment has been fined because guests wouldn't listen, or been forced to close for a couple of days, as a lesson, really. So yeah, people are very mindful of that now, that, if they say that 10:30, they don't mean 10:35. So the bars are suffering a little bit more. Some of them are pivoting to delivery. Some of them are doing collaborations with restaurants, so they serve cocktails as part of a meal, perhaps. But whatever it is, they all have to close at 10. They all have to stop serving alcohol at 10:30.
Right, so not the nightlife that people have been used to in Singapore in the past. But it's also such an international city. I mean, Singapore is such an international city, and I mean, it must, I'm assuming the borders are more or less closed.
Pretty much, yeah, unless people are coming in because they've been locked down in another city and they have family here, or they're studying here, those sorts of cases. But otherwise, yes, the borders are closed.
So without foreign visitors, are the restaurants still having enough custom to keep them going?
Oh, the restaurants are doing so well, which is really nice to see, because, before the lockdown, like I said, restaurants were doing terribly, right? So you had maybe January to April, where COVID, we first started seeing COVID maybe like January to February, right? And people stopped going out as much from February onwards. So the restaurants had been suffering for a good 3 or 4 months before we got locked down. But then once lockdown lifted, lockdown lifted somewhere, I think 19th of June, if I'm not wrong. And immediately after that, people were allowed to go to restaurants, and we're talking like groups of 5. So you can only go out in groups of 5, right? And in July, most of the restaurants reported the highest sales that they've done, either ever, really, because people were just so starved for going out to eat. And it being the summer holidays, for many of the expats who would typically leave Singapore to travel, they're all here. So people need to go out. Now, you can't go to a bar, you can't go to the cinemas, right? Singapore is very small. It's not as if you can go to a next state to go hiking or whatever. So what's left, and what do we love? Food, right? So the restaurants are doing famously well at the moment, which is really, really nice to see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good to hear. And it's also so encouraging that with the restaurants doing so well, albeit with some restrictions, that there isn't that community transmission among the, among restaurants. It's so heartening to hear that, you're able to keep it under control. Really, gives me hope for what happens and continues to happen in Australia. It's really good.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? You never know.
Well, it just sounds like you've got your ambassadors, you've got your rules, you've got people who want to eat and want to be able to continue eating and supporting a restaurant. So it just sounds like, you've really got it sorted. So I'm really, really happy to hear it. What about the supper clubs, Annette? Have you started having people back to your home?
So same with the restaurant. So you can only have no more than 5 people in your home at once. So where I used to serve between 6 to 9 people each evening, I now take only 5. But I'm pleased to say that I'm fully booked for the next month or so.
So, Annette, tell me, if I come to one of your supper club dinners, what would I expect? What kind of food are you going to serve me? Does everyone know each other, or am I meeting new people? Like, what's the scenario?
Okay, so for starters, reservations are for a group of, 5 at the moment because of COVID restrictions. But the reservation would be under one person. So you come and you bring your own group of friends, right? Yeah, so you're dining with people you already know. The kind of food I serve, I'm Peranakan, so I serve Peranakan food. I don't know if everyone is familiar with what Peranakan food is. It's basically sort of a melange of flavors influenced by Southeast Asia. So it's Chinese, Malay, a bit of Malay, Indonesian influences in the food. So it's quite spicy, very, very robust cuisine. And I try to modernize it a little bit, mainly by changing up the cooking technique, so it's a little bit more modern. In the past, you would pound lots of spices to make a curry. I don't pound spices. I don't have the time to pound spices and have 2 jobs. So, like for instance, my mother would have pounded the spices and cooked the food over a stove over a very long period of time. So what I do is I blend the spices, and then some of it I cook on the stove, but I tend to make my braises the Western way, which is in like a Dutch oven, covered with a cartouche and stewed in the oven for a couple of hours. So the flavors are exactly the same. The flavors are very traditional, but because the cooking methods are slightly different, the textures are also a little bit different. And I just try to do a couple of small twists here and there, just to keep things interesting.
Oh, I love it. So what's the next menu? What are you going to be serving?
So when I first started, my first menu, I didn't really know what I was doing, to be perfectly honest with you. It was really lots of people would say, you should have people over, because I entertained a lot. And people would say, I would love to bring my friends over to eat your food and stuff like that. So one day I decided, you know what, I'm just going to try this, right? So I knew that I wanted the food to be slightly different. So one of the things I first made was mee siam, which is a spicy rice vermicelli noodle that is typically served in a spicy broth. So what I did was I made the exact same spice mix. I made the exact same broth, but instead of just having noodles in the broth, I sort of made like a noodle rosti. So I pan fry the spiced noodles into like a crispy pancake, and then I put a prawn and quail egg sambal on top, and I serve the broth beside it.
Oh, so good. Wow.
So that became such a huge hit that I can't not make it, because people actually get upset when they come to dinner and they're like, what do you mean that's not on the menu? So that's always on the menu. Another dish that's almost always on the menu is a dish called pork belly buah keluak biryani. So buah keluak is this black nut that comes from Indonesia. It's very much a delicacy in Indonesian, Malay, and Singaporean cuisine. So I make like a pork belly braise with this with a spice mix and this nut. So I guess the closest thing to something similar in the Western world would be like a mole. So it's very dark and almost bitter, yeah. So it's very similar to a mole, but with just different spices. And then I serve it on a bit of rice that has been cooked in the similar spice mix, but in a biryani style. So at the end of the cooking, the rice gets some shallots and cashews that have been fried in ghee sort of tossed through it. So you get that very rich, buttery aroma. And that's one of the main dishes as well. And those are the two things that are pretty much always on the menu. Unless you've come here several times, then I would say, okay, let me make you something different.
Okay. I love it because I remember when I was in Penang, like I guess the Peranakan food is such a big part of what people eat there. But I guess it's so characteristic to have all these different influences in that food. And it feels to me like you're taking that forward because you're again just like taking all these different influences and able to reference all kinds of cuisines from around the world in a new style or contemporary Peranakan food. It sounds so exciting.
Thanks. Yeah, Singaporeans are very, very adventurous eaters. And we all love biryani. We Singaporeans, Muslims, of course not, but lots of people love eating, braised pork and things like that. So when I was thinking of how I could make this very traditional dish sort of more modern and something that people would really want to eat, this came to mind. So I just sort of invited some food writers over, some friends, and I said, look, try this and see what you think. And it was very unanimous that this was something that everyone liked. So I'm very glad about that. And that's always on the menu now.
So good. When I come, you're definitely making that, okay?
Definitely. I might not give you the mee siam because I'm kind of sick of making it, but
That's fine. As long as I get one of your classics, I'll be happy. But I know that you've written a lot about restaurants over the years, and it's something that I'm thinking a lot about as someone who also writes about restaurants is, what do you think the place of restaurant criticism is in a post-COVID world? Do you think there's a changing role for food writers?
I do, actually. I think for the longest time, the whole food critic thing has to evolve. It has evolved some, but it really has to evolve from being this judge that comes in somewhere and just has a meal and decides whether it's nice or not. And really, food is subjective, isn't it? I might like one thing and you might not. And where else, what other industry do you find that something is just so out there for everyone's judgment? I can't, apart from art, which not even the general public would critique. Food is one of those things that anyone can critique, right? So, and it's very demoralizing for the makers because no one sets out to make you bad food, right? So I think more and more food writers and food critics really need to understand what goes behind the meal, the stories behind the chefs and the people who make the meal. And in this day and age, not to criticize, but to encourage and to put a spotlight on people who are really doing things that are particularly special, whether in terms of the stories or the provenance or the way the food is made. I think the backstory of a restaurant or a hawker or whoever makes the food or a dish is very important these days, as opposed to just sitting down and saying, this is supposed to be this way, why is it not?
I completely agree. I think it's so important and also so interesting for us as writers to learn about the context of the food and to learn why something is the way it is. What is that person trying to express? What is the heritage that has brought them to this place? So I think it's endlessly rich, and it's much more fun as a writer to tell those stories than to say, yep, it's good. Nope, it's not good. I think it's a much it's richer for everybody, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but now that I both cook and write and cook semi-professionally, I think it's important for people who are going to critique the food that they spend some time in the kitchen and understand what the experience is like as a cook. before actually sitting down and and saying, that was not nice, but why was it not nice? Or that was really good. Why was it really good, right?
Right. It's given you a new appreciation for the art of cuisine. And I suppose the role of consistency, we're as home cooks and as restaurant cooks, everyone's dealing with produce that varies with, weather conditions or, whether, I don't know, I think the mood that you're cooking can affect the food as well. So I think there's all kinds of variables that go into it, aren't there?
Exactly, and now with the supply chains broken across the world, a lot of it depends on, you may get this ingredient today, you may not find it tomorrow, and how do you improvise and how do you carry on without these things that you've taken for granted?
That's so true. So Annette, tell me how you feel about the future in Singapore. Does it feel like the pandemic is more or less behind you? Does it feel like it's good times around the corner, or is it going to be a slow climb?
I think, Singapore being such a small country, we are very dependent on how other countries are doing, right? Because our domestic market is small. We don't have a lot of natural resources. So we do depend on imports and exports and all of those things in industry. So, locally on the ground, I would say, yes, things are definitely looking up. The fact that we can go out and enjoy life as we did, maybe in smaller groups of people, is a wonderful thing, having experienced what it was like in the early days of the virus. And I think that's as much as we can hope for, right? One day at a time. And we have some talk about Singapore opening its borders to certain countries, and they are recommending that Singaporeans can go to New Zealand, although I don't know if New Zealand's allowing Singaporeans in just yet. But, talk like that, this is giving us hope for sure. We definitely need more of an economy, and that, again, depends on the world. But, yeah, I think life is good. We cannot complain at this point.
I'm so happy to hear it. I really feel like as I'm sitting here in stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne, I'm so happy to hear about this. And I know that when I'm sitting in a Singapore hawker market with some prawn noodles, and that's just my second lunch, and then I'm going to have a dinner, and then I'm coming to you for my second dinner, then I really feel like the world is getting back to normal, and I can eat what I want, where I want, when I want.
Fantastic. Yes, in the Singaporean context, we can't wait till the day that we can go, down to Yarra for a wine tasting and all of that as well.
I love it. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Annette, for sharing your perspective with us today. It's just a thrill to jump into your steamy Singapore world for a little while. Thanks for giving us the Singapore bulletin today. Really fantastic to talk to you.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about. We spend a week thrashing around each issue, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This is a Deep in the Weeds production.